All right, my accent is a clue to my history, right? And even though it may not sound like it, my family is from Warri. Both sides of my family is from Warri, and this is part of who I am. This accent is a melting point of all the countries that I've lived in, all the cultures that have influenced me, and I stand before you as someone whose grandmother here had raised her 12 children without ever learning how to speak, read, or write English. And the thing that I would always want to say is that, like, for me and my 22 cousins, we can never learn about her history from her mouth directly because we don't speak Isoko. That, to me, is the part that's the tragedy, because we don't learn that part of our history. What I did growing up is that I learned history from the textbooks. I learned history from others, you know, from the Western media growing up in the US. And what I would want to ask my grandmother is how she was able to do that, because in the Nigeria of today, that would be almost impossible. I saw a tweet the other day when a young returnee, she remarked that, you know, it's been 7 years since she moved back. Nigeria is progressing. It's gotten better. It's slow, but, you know, things are getting better. What she got in return was a series of insults and a series of people asking her, please back it up with data. On one hand, Nigeria is doing better with mobile penetration, internet, and there is finally venture capital funding coming to the country. But what you cannot deny is that we have the highest number of people living in extreme poverty. We have the highest number of out-of-school children, and what we're really living with is a facade of a democracy. When we have conversations with older Nigerians, they talk about the good old days before oil, and even when protests would run supreme. People challenge the status quo because it just wasn't good enough. And now, these conversations make me realize that, again, I don't know much about what has happened in our past, and we simply continue to accept what the world says Nigeria is. And it wasn't until I got much older that I started to question these things and started realizing, you know, what is this thing they said about Africa, as if we began with slavery and today we all run on foreign aid and oil, is just simply not true. As Napoleon Bonaparte once said, history is written by the victors. So today, I want to challenge to you what Africa will say, and historians will say about us 50, 100, 200 years from now if we don't change what we invest in. At some point between Mansa Musa being the richest person that's ever lived, to the Egyptians creating pyramids that researchers still can't figure out today, we as Africans fell behind in innovation. While we continue to fall into extreme poverty, China is producing 2 new billionaires per week. While the Nigerian government was running a factory for pencils, Skyrise in California was now launching autonomous helicopters. In my mother's lifetime, international universities used to come to this country and set up their shop. But today, you have over 1 million students that pass JAMB every year, but they can't get admission because there's physically no seats in class. Even those that are educated, they're working on a curriculum that's behind, and they're not able to compete in the global economy. Poverty and circumstance have turned us into people that think of today versus patiently building for the future. The only way that we will be ever able to catch up is through massive innovation. We are so far behind that we need to accelerate really quickly through innovation, otherwise we'll be stuck. It's almost unfair to ask each one of you to be long-term greedy and build for a country that doesn't support you. But instead, I can ask that of our leaders. By definition, the public sector is meant to lay the infrastructure and do the heavy lifting to move us forward. But instead, we're riddled with archaic policies and that same right now thinking that is robbing our future. Last week, I attended various UN General Assembly events and listened to our leaders challenge how come Nigerian youth are not investing and building companies around education or health. And I mumbled under my breath, we are. In Nigeria alone, there are at least 50 education technology companies, and companies like Helium Health and 54Gene are changing the way Black bodies are viewed in the $9 trillion global healthcare sector. Another one of our governors now said, well, if you guys just came to us with really good ideas, we would back you, we'd invest in you. Mumbled a little louder, that's actually not true again. Of the $300 million that came into Nigerian tech companies last year, over 90% came from outside of the country. Not because we don't have HNIs or the governments don't have budgets for these things, they just don't care. For the past 3.5 years, I've been both an investor and operator in African tech, and the trend is not in our favor. Private funding for the continent continues to go to those solving for our basic and very much needed African problems. You have companies solving for water and power and roads. Those things are good, but again, we're so far behind. What happens instead is that foreign companies now say, take our problems, innovate, and they're able to come to our shores and now take over. So give an example. I love the life-saving work of this company called Zipline. They deliver blood around using drone technology in countries like Rwanda and Ghana. They build their entire platform in California. They say they're proudly a California company. They've used that to raise $225 million, valued at over $1.2 billion, and all they do is now exchange that for hiring a few local people. Every single part of their profit goes outside of the continent. Now compare them to LifeBank, which is founded by a Nigerian company. It's still doing the same life-saving blood. It's still using technology, but she's not even been able to raise up to $1 million. Now, I've come to accept that we cannot private sector our way to innovation and innovative development. We need the public sector to make decisive and drastic changes that span administrations, and there's precedence for it. In 2017, I was a delegate at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Hyderabad, India, and I was amazed at how in less than 4 years, government policies to promote innovation and massive investments in technology and infrastructure more than doubled the number of tech startups. The city is essentially one big government-driven tech incubator. Global giants like Microsoft and Google have now built on these base layers and now employ tens of thousands of people per year, significantly upskilling them to be on par with the world. Innovation just doesn't come from technology. It's also in business practices, policies, and good governance. Let's look at Singapore, who in less than 40 years went from developing country to the status as a global financial hub. The government instituted sound financial and economic policy, coupled with a corruption-free environment and room for tech advancement, which drew the top innovators to innovate in Singapore. Now notice a link in both of those examples. Government-driven innovation that helped people build within their borders. Instead, Africa is exporting its brilliant minds to innovate elsewhere because there's not an enabling environment here. For example, 26-year-old Silas Adekunle, who's basically the top robotics prodigy in the world, he was snapped up by Apple and given free rein to build whatever he wants within their environment. Or take South African Elon Musk, who's basically built some of the best companies on Earth and now wants to move humans to Mars. How do we help them innovate within our borders? How do we ensure that when our stories are told, it's because of being African and not in spite of it? It can't only be from investing in basic African problems, and it can't be from expecting the private sector to take us forward. We will never be able to catch up. So an institution from the private side that tried to step into the shoes of our Nigerian regulators was Andela. They came in and they've educated thousands and thousands of engineers and then outsourced their skills to companies like Facebook and Apple. While this has led Andela itself to $50 million in revenue in just 5 short years, they had to release 400 developers last week back into the unemployment pool. Imagine if our government had taken these newly trained engineers and helped subsidize their costs to try to solve some of our problems. But instead, it was the tech ecosystem, the private sector again, that stepped in to try to help. On the same day that our tech ecosystem leaders were around helping these developers, our government was passing regulations to tax deposits, to tax withdrawals, and all the kinds of online transactions, literally further hampering the same people that are helping. Public sector needs to make it truly easier to do business. It's not just a phrase or putting a form online, and it's now making Nigeria a place. You can't say it's open for business when all your policies show otherwise. Nigeria is a place where foreign investors hesitate to put money because they may not be able to repatriate it back out. It's a place where people are still dying from basic illnesses like malaria, and we hopefully have fully eradicated polio. It's a place where citizens rely on their family members in the diaspora to send back $24 billion a year for them to be able to survive. That $24 billion is more than the country earns from oil revenues. After countless sessions with passionate Nigerians who want to build a country better than what we inherited, we concluded there are just 3 things that we need from our government that could drastically change the trajectory of Nigeria and our place in history. We don't need the government to leapfrog for solving for extreme poverty to building centers for artificial intelligence. We need them to give each citizen an identity. We need them to build critical infrastructure and to pass smart, protective legislation. With these in place, innovation can fast forward us through our current challenges and we'll be able to thrive. So why identification? When you look at me, you can make assumptions about where you think I went to school, what you think my background is, but identification will truly tell you who I am and what I've been through. In Nigeria, you maybe have my BVN, so you understand where I have bank accounts and some transactions I deal with. But in the US, where I have a social security number, it's been with me since the day I was born. That social security number shows where I went to school, it shows even what elections I voted in, and it shows all of the places that I've lived and spent my money. That allows the banks to be able to give me low-cost insurance, like low-cost products. It allows insurance companies to protect my assets, and it allows for democracy to reign. So what that key thing about having an identity for every single citizen, are we really 200 million people? We don't actually know, right? So how do you tell the Nigerian government to go about identifying every single person? There's precedence for it. The World Bank has an entire program called Identification for Developing Countries. They've given tens of millions of dollars to our country to identify, but we are still lacking behind. But if you go over to Uganda, in just 8 short months, they were able to identify over 98% of the people over 16 years old. Literally did it in 8 months. Now, all of these things about having identification, it will help fix ghost workers, it'll fix election issues, insurance services, and delivery of social investment. It means that you and your concerns are counted and every single citizen has a voice. Now, if you go back to the same history I started with, we can learn one thing from that horrendous tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade. Africa, particularly West Africa and Nigeria, are optimal locations to trade with Europe and America. With our high youth population and vast natural resources, we should be an industrial manufacturing hub battling Asian countries. Instead, the cost to run a business today, whether you're generating your own power or you're pumping your own water, fixing your own roads, and having to get multiple data subscriptions, it's expensive, it's just simply prohibitive. So we need infrastructure to fund the 80% of SMEs that are contributing to 50% of Nigeria's GDP. Instead, our banks and pension funds are going to go put their money in T-bills rather than giving it to you to grow your business. We need infrastructure that would give us clean water and healthcare, but instead, millions are dying from malaria and typhoid. We need infrastructure that's going to give us light, so you can run your factory or your kids can do their homework. But instead, we're spending $13 billion a year on fuel and diesel. Now we come into all of these things about power, right? In Nigeria, there's a whole Power Africa program that's been trying to go around lighting up the continent. And they talk about the biggest reason why over 45% of our country is not even connected to the grid, and why the things that are hard for them to fund are macroeconomic factors, lack of credit-worthy utilities, and a lack of strong, transparent regulator. So again, the big thing for them is if the government is on the right side, people will fund it, but they're not. We as individuals, and more importantly our institutions, must invest capital into local innovators that are building groundbreaking technology to ensure we catch up with the rest of the world. We need to give our innovators options besides leaving the country to really change history. If our government does their job, then that allows us as private citizens to build on top of that. We could be building innovation villages, encouraging our pension funds to invest in venture capital, and we should have conferences featuring far-out innovation, and our local news should be talking about these people rather than amplifying our poverty. We need to demand more from our leaders to not simply feed our bellies today, but to plant the seeds for tomorrow. I've given you 3 simple points that you can use to add substance to your Twitter complaints. Demand that our leaders identify us, that they build their infrastructure, and that they actually pass sound legislation. So what would you like history to say about the steps we took after this moment in time? Did we simply go back home and maybe take our picture? I attended a TEDx, you post that on Facebook. Or did you actually go to Honorable Ben and tell him and the others that represent you what you actually need? So will history say that we were then colonized again because we have all these vast resources and our huge population? And if you go and say, I'm a Nigerian, they automatically assume you with fraud. Or will they come out and say that we rose and we were greater than the Egyptians and Malians before us? Thank you very much.